At 75 years old, the life of Richard Gere is one of dazzling highs and devastating lows. And while many of us still picture him as the charming leading man from Pretty Woman or the unforgettable star in An Officer and a Gentleman, the truth is that Richard's journey has been far more complex, emotional, and heartbreaking than the polished image Hollywood once sold us. So, welcome back to the channel. And today we're diving deep into the tragedy of Richard Gere, a story that's not just about an actor's career, but about the sacrifices, struggles, and painful realities of a man who gave everything to his craft, only to face rejection, heartbreak, and battles that few ever saw. And to really understand the depth of this tragedy, we have to rewind to the very beginning, because Richard Gere wasn't born into fame or fortune. He grew up in Syracuse, New York, in a middle-class family where his father worked as an insurance agent and his mother was a homemaker. And like many kids of his generation, he dreamed big, showing an early passion for music and performance, excelling as a trumpeter and a gymnast before eventually gravitating toward acting. But it wasn't an easy road. He didn't walk into Hollywood with connections or privilege. Instead, he struggled through small theater productions, honing his craft on stage, taking whatever work he could find, often living paycheck to paycheck, and for years, he was just another young man in New York chasing a dream that seemed almost impossible, until a breakout role in the Broadway production of Grease gave him the recognition that would later propel him into film. And yet, even when the doors of Hollywood finally opened, Richard's early career wasn't smooth. He was often criticized for being too pretty or too soft for serious roles. And while movies like American Gigolo and Days of Heaven started to build his reputation, it wasn't until An Officer and a Gentleman that Richard became a global star, cementing his place as one of the most magnetic leading men of the 1980s. But fame, as it so often does, came with a heavy price, because while audiences adored him, the media was relentless. Gossip magazines constantly pried into his relationships, his friendships, and even fabricated cruel rumors that haunted him for years. And this constant invasion left Richard torn between his desire for privacy and the demands of celebrity culture, which never let him breathe. And while he tried to maintain a sense of normalcy, his personal life began to unravel, particularly his highly publicized marriage to supermodel Cindy Crawford, which seemed picture-perfect on the surface, but behind closed doors was filled with tension, pressure, and the crushing weight of two people constantly in the spotlight, ultimately ending in divorce that left both of them scarred and the public. With endless speculation, and after that, Richard entered and exited relationships, never quite finding the long-term stability he longed for until much later in life. And while this might seem like just another Hollywood love story gone wrong, the truth is, it deeply affected Richard. He often admitted in interviews that he struggled to balance his career with his personal life, and it left him yearning for a deeper sense of connection and family, something that felt just out of reach for decades. But Richard's tragedies didn't end with his personal relationships. His career, which should have flourished for decades, was derailed by something far more insidious: politics. Because Richard wasn't just a movie star, he was also a deeply compassionate activist, outspoken about human rights, particularly his support for Tibet and his close relationship with the Dalai Lama. And while his intentions were noble and his passion genuine, Hollywood is an industry that plays heavily to international markets, especially China, and Richard's advocacy against the Chinese government's policies in Tibet effectively blacklisted him from major productions, because studios didn't want to risk losing access to one of the biggest film markets in the world. And slowly but surely, Richard Gere, once a guaranteed box office draw, found himself excluded from the types of projects his peers were still landing. And while he continued to act in smaller independent films and even delivered some of his finest performances in those roles, the mainstream spotlight dimmed, leaving fans wondering why an actor of his caliber wasn't appearing in more major films. And the heartbreaking truth is that Hollywood quietly turned its back on him, not because he lost his talent, but because he refused to compromise his principles. And while Richard himself has said he doesn't regret standing up for what he believes in, the career consequences were devastating, especially when he was at the height of his power. And in many ways, this was the beginning of the long decline of his Hollywood presence. Now, add to this the realities of aging, and the picture becomes even more somber. Because as Richard entered his 70s, reports of health struggles began to surface, with rumors of serious illnesses and medical scares reminding fans that even their screen idols are vulnerable. And though Richard has never been one to dwell publicly on his pain, the natural toll of time is undeniable, and it's heartbreaking to see a man who once seemed invincible on screen now facing the frailties of age, especially as he's raising young children with his current wife, Spanish. Activist Alejandra Silva, who is decades younger, meaning Richard is simultaneously trying to be an active father while also dealing with the limitations of being in his mid-70s, a situation that carries its own unique challenges and emotional weight. Because while he loves his children dearly, he has openly expressed his awareness that he may not have as much time with them as he wishes, and that realization is devastating for any parent, let alone someone who has spent much of his life searching for lasting happiness. And this is perhaps the most human, most relatable tragedy of Richard Gere, not the gossip headlines or the Hollywood drama, but the quiet, personal awareness of time slipping away, of missed opportunities, and of the struggle to balance love, family, and legacy in the final chapters of life. And yet, despite all of this, Richard Gere continues to inspire, because while his story is undeniably tragic in many ways, it is also a story of resilience and courage, because few actors have managed to balance stardom with activism the way he has. Few have endured being blacklisted, yet continued to work on projects that mattered to them, and few have carried themselves with as much grace in the face of rumors, heartbreak, and rejection. And if anything, the tragedy of Richard Gere is not that he fell, but that he was pushed aside by forces beyond his control, yet still chose to walk his path with dignity, focusing his energy on causes greater than himself, supporting humanitarian work, and investing in his role as a father, proving that while fame may fade, character endures, and as fans, we may feel heartbreak when we see how Hollywood has treated him, or when we hear whispers about his health. But we can also take comfort in knowing that Richard Gere has lived authentically, true to himself. And that may be the most powerful legacy of all. So, when we look back at Richard Gere at 75, we see a story filled with contradictions. The glamorous star who longed for privacy, the heartthrob who yearned for lasting love, the actor who was punished for his principles, the man who once had it all yet still faced loneliness, illness, and rejection. And while the tragedies of his life are beyond heartbreaking, they also paint a picture of someone profoundly human, someone whose struggles mirror the very same challenges many of us face in our own lives: aging, health, love, loss, and the pursuit of meaning. And maybe that's why Richard Gere resonates so deeply. Because behind the Hollywood persona is a man who simply wanted to be respected for his craft, loved for who he was, and remembered for standing up for what he believed in. And as time moves forward, even as his presence on the big screen becomes rarer, his story continues to touch millions, reminding us that fame does not protect anyone from tragedy, but how we respond to that tragedy is what defines us. And in Richard Gere's case, his quiet resilience, his unwavering compassion, and his dignity in the face of hardship ensure that his legacy will endure, not just as a Hollywood leading man, but as a symbol of integrity and strength. And as we close this emotional journey, I want to know what you think. Has Richard Gere's story changed the way you see him? Do you believe he deserved more recognition for his activism and talent? And which of his roles left the biggest impression on you? Let's keep this conversation going in the comments. And if you found this deep dive insightful, moving, or eye-opening, please give this video a like, share it with others who love classic Hollywood stories, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more heartfelt looks into the real lives behind the stars we admire, because Richard Gere's journey may be heartbreaking, but it's also unforgettable, and his resilience is a lesson for us all.